Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that wander through the forgotten corners of history with a touch of melancholy and dry humor, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales like this one. Now, settle in as we unfold the first chapter of our story. I, one castle ghost, just wanted a hug and got exorcised instead. Chapter 1. The Lonely Specter of Blackthorn Keep. Blackthorn Keep stood atop the crags of the northern moors like a crumbling monument to stubbornness. The stones, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, bore the scars of sieges, betrayals, and at least one very unfortunate kitchen fire caused by an over-ambitious roast goose. The castle had seen better days, but then again, so had most of its inhabitants, especially Alistair. Alistair was not a particularly fearsome ghost, which was something of a professional embarrassment in spectral circles. While other phantoms rattled chains, whispered curses, or flung cutlery with vengeful glee, Alistair mostly lingered in the drafty hallways, sighing at the portraits of long-dead nobles, who no longer answered back. His existence was one of profound solitude, a fact made all the more tragic by the simple truth that Alistair did not want him to be terrified. He wanted, more than anything, to be unnoticed, not in the way most ghosts craved attention. No, he had no interest in sending maids fleeing in terror or inspiring local legends of doom. Alistair's desires were far more mundane, and thus far more impossible. He wanted someone to, in talking to him, to acknowledge him. Perhaps, if he dared to dream, to offer him a friendly pat on the back, or, in his most secret hopes, a hug. It wasn't as if he hadn't tried. Over the centuries, Alistair had experimented with every method of non-threatening ghostly interaction. He had attempted to hum along with minstrels, though his voice tended to make the candles flicker ominously. He had tried to assist lost travelers by gently pointing them toward the least moldy guest chambers. They usually misinterpreted this as a sinister omen and fled. Once, he had even mustered the courage to materialize halfway during a feast in the great hall, clearing his throat politely before asking if anyone might spare a moment for conversation. The resulting chaos, involving a flung wine goblet, a fainting baron, and an impromptu exorcism performed with a soup ladle, had convinced him to retreat into the walls for a good 50 years. The problem, Alistair reflected as he drifted through the castle's abandoned chapel, was that people had very fixed ideas about ghosts. They expected moaning, they expected menace, they expected to be haunted. They did not expect a specter with a lonesome heart and a tendency to apologize for drifting through solid objects. Tonight, however, was different. Tonight, the castle had new visitors. Not the usual band of drunken nobles or superstitious villagers, but a pair of scholars from some distant university, armed with lanterns, notebooks, and an alarming quantity of dried herbs. Alistair watched from the shadows as they unpacked their belongings in the great hall, their voices echoing with excitement. They were here, one explained to the other, to document the supernatural phenomena of Blackthorn Keep. Alistair's non-existent heart fluttered. Here, at last, were people who wanted to encounter a ghost. Perhaps, if he were careful, if he approached them just right, he might finally have his chance at conversation. Maybe even, dare he think it, a fleeting moment of connection. He hovered by the staircase, practicing his least alarming smile. It was a delicate balance, too faint, and they might not see him at all, too visible, and they might scream. He adjusted his spectral cravat, a habit left over from mortal life, and took a deep breath he didn't strictly need. This was it. Centuries of solitude could finally end. And so, with all the fragile hope of a ghost who had forgotten what warmth felt like, Alistair stepped into the lantern light and said, in his gentlest, most reassuring voice, "Good evening. Might I trouble you for a moment of your time?" The scholars looked up. Their eyes widened. One of them dropped his notebook. The other fumbled for a vial of something that smelled suspiciously like holy water. Alistair sighed. It was going to be one of Wytho's nights. Chapter 2. A History of Unwanted Visitors. Blackthorn Keep had never been a welcoming place. Even in its heyday, when its banners fluttered in the wind, and its halls echoed with the clatter of feasting nobles, there had always been an air of unease about it. The stone walls, though thick and imposing, seemed to hold whispers just beneath the surface, murmurs of betrayal, poisonings, and the occasional unfortunate incident involving a loose suit of armor and a suspiciously convenient flight of stairs. The castle's first lord, a man by the name of Reginald Blackthorn, had been the sort of person who believed strongly in the virtues of paranoia and had a habit of testing his wine for poison by making his guests drink it first. His hospitality was so famously lacking that neighboring nobles often invented urgent pilgrimages or sudden illnesses to avoid his invitations. Reginald, in turn, took this as proof of their guilt and spent his remaining years building secret passages, hiring increasingly twitchy guards, and writing a very long and mostly incoherent treatise on the many ways one might be stabbed in the back, literally and figuratively. By the time Alistair had been alive, back when blood still ran through his veins, and he could appreciate a good roast pheasant without it passing straight through him, the castle's reputation had only worsened. The Blackthorns had a knack for attracting the worst sorts of guests: scheming relatives, disgraced knights, and at least one minstrel whose songs were so terrible that legend claimed the walls themselves groaned in protest. Alistair, then a young and overly earnest steward, had done his best to maintain order, but even he had to admit that the castle seemed cursed long before any actual ghosts showed up. One particular grim winter, a visiting baron had frozen to death in his bedchamber after a servant, tired of the man's constant complaining, accidentally left the window open all night. Another time, a celebrated knight had choked on a piece of mutton during a feast, leading to a prolonged and awkward silence as the other guests debated whether it was more impolite to interrupt his dying gurgles or to let him finish. Then there was the infamous case of Lady Eleanor, who had vanished from her locked chambers one evening, leaving behind only a single slipper and a note that read, "Quite simply, I've had enough." Alistair had always suspected she'd escaped through the secret passage, because the tapestry in question depicted a rather graphic hunting scene involving a boar and several unlucky hounds. No one had ever been brave enough to check. The castle's history was, in short, a relentless parade of misfortune, bad decisions, and people who really should have known better than to accept an invitation to Blackthorn Keep. And yet, despite it all, Alistair had loved the place. Or at least, he had loved the idea of it. The grandeur, the history, the possibility that someday someone might walk through its doors and see not a den of treachery, but a home. That hope had died with him, of course. Alistair wasn't entirely sure how he'd become a ghost. One moment he had been attempting to mediate a disagreement between two lords over a disputed barrel of wine, a debate that had escalated to the point where one of them had drawn a dagger, and the other had responded by throwing a cheese wheel. The next, he was standing in the great hall, staring down at his own body sprawled unceremoniously across the rushes, a look of mild surprise still etched on his face. The lords, to their credit, had at least looked embarrassed. One of them had the decency to say, "Oh," in a tone that suggested he hadn't actually meant to stab the steward. The other offered to fetch a physician, which would have been more touching if Alistair hadn't already been very obviously dead. And so, with no fanfare and no particular reason, Alistair had remained. At first he assumed it was temporary, some cosmic clerical error that would soon be corrected. But as the years turned to decades and the decades to centuries, he came to understand that he was stuck. The living came and went, each new generation forgetting the last, and none of them ever stayed long enough to learn his name. Now, as he watched the scholars scramble for their holy water, Alistair felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle over him. He had hoped foolishly that these two might be different, that perhaps their books and their studies had prepared them for the idea of a ghost who just wanted to chat. But their wide eyes and trembling hands told him everything he needed to know. Still, he couldn't help but try one more time. "I don't suppose," he said carefully, that either of you would be interested in hearing about the castle's history. I was the steward here once. I know all sorts of things. For example, did you know there's a secret passage behind the vial of holy water hit him square in the chest. It didn't hurt exactly. Ghosts weren't technically capable of feeling pain, at least not the physical kind. But it did produce a rather unpleasant sizzling sensation, like being dunked in a vat of overly enthusiastic lemon juice. Alistair looked down at his now faintly glowing torso, then back up at the scholars. "Oh," he said with a sigh. "That's new." The scholars, for their part, were already halfway to the door, their notebooks abandoned, their lanterns swinging wildly. Alistair considered following them, just to see how far they'd run, but the effort seemed exhausting. Instead, he drifted over to the nearest chair, one of the few pieces of furniture that hadn't yet rotted into oblivion, and sat down. Or rather, he attempted to sit down, only to remember halfway through the motion that chairs were no longer a concern for him. He ended up hovering just above the seat, his legs crossed awkwardly, like a man who had very much intended to perch on thin air. Outside, the wind howled through the castle's empty towers, a sound that had once been mournful, but now just felt repetitive. Alistair listened to it, as he had 1,000 times before, and wondered if this was all there would ever be. Then, from somewhere deep in the castle, came a noise he hadn't heard in centuries. Laughter. Not the cruel, mocking laughter of long-dead nobles, nor the nervous giggling of fleeing scholars, but genuine, delighted laughter. The kind that suggested someone had just discovered the secret passage behind the tapestry, and was having a marvelous time getting lost in it. Alistair straightened up. Perhaps, just perhaps, the night wasn't over yet. Chapter 3. The Misunderstood Moans. Alistair had never intended to become a moaning specter. In life, he had been a man of measured words and deliberate actions, the sort of steward who could mediate a dispute over land rights with a well-placed cough and a raised eyebrow. But death, as it turned out, had a way of stripping a person of their eloquence. The first time he had tried to speak to a living soul, after his untimely stabbing, his voice had emerged as a low, echoing groan that rattled the rafters and sent a visiting bishop sprinting for the nearest horse. It wasn't his fault, really. Ghostly vocal cords, if one could call them that, were notoriously unreliable. Sometimes his words came out clear as a bell, if slightly muffled, as if spoken through a very old pillow. Other times they dissolved into the kind of wail that made dogs howl in sympathy and small children burst into tears. Once, he had attempted to compliment a particularly well-polished suit of armor, only to produce a sound so bone-chilling that the maid who heard it immediately resigned her position, moved to a neighboring village, and took up weaving as a form of therapy. Alistair had hoped that practice might improve things. He spent long nights drifting through the castle's empty corridors, rehearsing pleasantries in what he hoped was a gentle tone. "Good evening," he would murmur into the darkness, only for it to slither out as good evening, like a draught through a cracked tomb. He tried whispering, which resulted in an unsettling susurrus that made even the rats pause mid-scuttle. He tried singing, an experiment that ended when a traveling bard camping in the Great Hall abruptly packed up his lute and declared the place artistically cursed. The worst part was that Alistair knew exactly how it sounded. He had heard the stories that sprang up around Blackthorn Keep, the tales of a wailing spirit doomed to wander the halls in eternal torment. Visitors spoke in hushed tones of the ghost's mournful dirge, its agonized lament. No one ever stopped to consider that the ghost might just be trying to ask if they'd like a tour of the library. Take, for example, the incident with the chimney sweep. The man had been hired to clear the flues ahead of a noble's visit, a futile effort given that the castle's fireplaces hadn't seen a proper blaze in decades. But lords would insist on these things. Alistair, spotting an opportunity for conversation, had floated up beside him as he worked and said quite politely, "That's a very sturdy brush you have there. What emerged was a guttural, "Whoa, gay, stewardy brush," that echoed up the chimney like the voice of a damned soul. The sweep screamed, lost his footing, and tumbled backward into a pile of soot. By the time he'd scrambled to his feet, Alistair had already retreated behind a tapestry, clutching his spectral head in his hands. The sweep, meanwhile, was halfway to the next county, leaving behind his tools, his hat, and a very confused badger that had been living in the chimney and was now wondering where all the noise had come from. Even the rare visitors who claimed to seek out the supernatural were disappointments. A pair of ghost hunters once arrived with an array of brass instruments and a solemn vow to document the phenomena. Alistair, hopeful at last, had waited until they were settled in the solar before attempting to introduce himself. He cleared his throat, a sound like a rusty hinge protesting its existence, and said, "Welcome to Blackthorn Keep. I am Alistair, the steward of this castle." The resulting cacophony, "Welcome to Blackthorn Keep," Alistair, sent one of the ghost hunters into a fit of hysterics, while the other fainted directly onto his own spirit-detecting apparatus, which began whirring violently and emitting sparks. Alistair had watched, crestfallen, as they fled into the night, their notes abandoned, their expensive equipment left to smolder on the floor. He had tried. He had really tried. But no matter how carefully he enunciated, his words always twisted into something out of a penny dreadful. And so, over time, he had resigned himself to the role the living had assigned him, the mournful wraith of Blackthorn Keep, doomed to wander its halls in eternal sorrow. If visitors heard his voice and shuddered, well, at least they were reacting to him. That was something. But now, as he listened to the unfamiliar laughter echoing from somewhere deep in the castle, Alistair felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in centuries: curiosity. Whoever was down there wasn't screaming. They weren't running. They were laughing. Perhaps, he thought, drifting toward the sound, this was his chance to try again. He rounded a corner and saw her, a young woman in a mud-spattered dress, standing in the middle of the old banquet hall and grinning up at the cobwebbed chandelier. She had the air of someone who had just discovered a room full of free sweets and was debating where to start. Alistair hesitated. Then, steeling himself, he took a deep breath he didn't need and said as clearly as he could manage, "Hello there." The words left his lips, twisted through the air, and emerged as a sepulchral "Hello the that made the candelabras tremble. The woman turned, and then, to Alistair's astonishment, she laughed. "Oh," she said, clapping her hands together. "You must be the ghost. I was hoping I'd meet you." Alistair stared. No one had ever hoped to meet him before. She tilted her head. "You're not going to, I don't know, drag me into the walls or anything, are you?" Alistair, too surprised to mind his voice, blurted, "Why would I do that?" The woman nodded, as if this were a perfectly reasonable response. "Good point. So, what do you do around here for fun? Haunt people? Flicker lights? Wait! No, let me guess. You moan dramatically at visitors, and then get sad when they run away." Alistair opened his mouth, closed it. Then, very quietly, he said, "Yes." The woman beamed. "I knew it. I'm Cora, by the way. Professional ruin explorer, amateur ghost enthusiast," as she patted the satchel at her side. "Bringer of snacks. Do you like oatcakes? I have oatcakes." Alistair looked at the satchel, then at Cora, then back at the satchel. For the first time in centuries, he didn't care how his voice sounded when he said, "Ye love oatcakes." Cora grinned. "Fantastic. Now, tell me everything about this place, and don't skip the embarrassing bits." And so, for the first time in centuries, Alistair did. Chapter 4. Failed Friendship with the Castle Mice. Before Cora had arrived with her oatcakes, and her baffling lack of fear, Alistair's only potential companions in Blackthorn Keep had been the mice. This was not for lack of effort on his part. He had tried repeatedly to strike up friendships with the occasional bat, a family of particularly bold spiders, and once memorably a very confused owl that had flown in through a broken window and refused to acknowledge his existence, no matter how politely he greeted it. But the mice had been his great hope. They lived in the walls, they didn't scream at his voice, and most importantly, they were always there. His first attempt at camaraderie had been a disaster. He had noticed a small gray mouse nibbling on a scrap of tapestry in the solar, and thrilled at the opportunity for interaction, had drifted closer and said in what he hoped was a mouse-friendly tone, "Hello there, little fellow." The resulting sound, "Hello there, little fellow," had sent the mouse into such a frenzy that it bolted straight up the wall, bounced off a beam, and disappeared into a hole with a squeak that could only be described as deeply offensive. Alistair had spent the next hour apologizing through the crack in the wainscoting, but the mouse had not reappeared for a full week, and when it did, it gave him a look of profound betrayal before scurrying away with its tiny nose in the air. Undeterred, Alistair had refined his approach. He practiced modulating his voice into something softer, less likely to send small creatures into existential panic. He discovered that if he hummed, a low, steady drone, rather than the echoing dirge his normal speech became, the mice would sometimes pause in their scuttling and twitch their whiskers in his direction. Progress, he had thought. Then came the great cheese experiment. It had seemed like a stroke of genius at the time. Mice liked cheese. Everyone knew that. So Alistair had painstakingly gathered every crumb of aged cheddar he could find left behind by rare visitors, no easy feat when one lacked hands, and arranged them in a neat semicircle outside a well-used mouse hole. Then he had settled down to wait, humming softly to himself. The first mouse to emerge had been a portly fellow with one ear slightly chewed, likely a veteran of many castle skirmishes. It had sniffed the air, waddled forward, and then stopped dead at the sight of Alistair. For a long moment, they had stared at each other. Then, with the air of a creature making a calculated risk, the mouse had darted forward, snatched the largest cheese crumb, and fled. Alistair had been delighted. Success. A connection. The next night, he laid out more cheese. This time, 3 mice appeared. Then, 5 doors. Then, on the 4th night, an entire delegation of rodents had crept out, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight, their tiny paws poised for rapid retreat. Alistair, overcome with emotion, had whispered, "I'm so glad we're becoming friends." The phrase, warped by ghostly acoustics, had emerged as "ITM so glad we're becoming friends." The effect was immediate. Mice scattered in every direction, some squeaking in alarm, others tripping over their own tails in their haste to escape. One particularly panicked individual had run straight into a wall, shaken itself off, and then sprinted directly into the opposite wall before finally finding the hole. The cheese, meanwhile, was abandoned in the stampede. Alistair had sighed and let the crumbs dematerialize. Still, he had persisted. If the mice wouldn't accept his friendship through food or conversation, perhaps they would appreciate his help. He began discreetly shooing away the castle's lone, lazy cat, a creature so ancient and half-blind it barely qualified as a predator anymore, whenever it lurked near the mice's favorite roots. He wafted drafts to warn them of approaching footsteps. Once, he had even attempted to construct a tiny nest for them out of shredded parchment, though the result had looked more like a deranged bird's project than anything habitable. The mice, for their part, had tolerated him. They no longer fled at the sight of him, though they still gave him a wide berth when his voice slipped into its eerier registers. Occasionally, one would pause mid-scamper and regard him with what might have been pity before continuing on its way. It wasn't until Cora arrived that Alistair realized the true depth of his failure. "You tried to befriend the mice?" she had asked, crunching on an oatcake as they drifted through the kitchens. "They were the only ones who would stay," Alistair admitted. Cora had nodded sagely. Ah, and how'd that go? Alistair had gestured to a nearby mouse hole, from which a single beady eye was watching them with unmistakable wariness. Cora had snorted. Right. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're very friend-shaped. For a ghost, I mean. Alistair hadn't known how to respond to that. So he had said the only thing that felt true. Thank you. The mouse in the hole had sighed and retreated into the darkness. Chapter 5. The tragic tale of the last hug. Alistair had never told anyone how he died. Not the fleeing scholars, not the terrified chimney sweeps, not even the mice, though they had witnessed the aftermath with their usual rodent indifference. But as he sat beside Cora, on the crumbling steps of the great hall, watching her brush oatcake crumbs from her skirt, he found the words bubbling up like a long dam stream, finally breaking through. It was the cheese wheel, he said, his voice, for once soft and clear, untwisted by the usual spectral echo. Cora paused mid-bite. The what now? Alistair gestured vaguely toward the high table where the lords had once feasted. The final argument. The one that got me killed. It started over a cheese wheel. Cora blinked. Then, with the air of someone settling in for a particularly good story, she set down her oatcake and said, "You have to explain that." And so, Alistair did. It had been the autumn of 1392, during what should have been a routine diplomatic dinner between Lord Blackthorn and his perpetually disgruntled neighbor, Lord Pembroke. The two had been arguing for years over a stretch of woodland that each claimed was rightfully theirs, a debate that had escalated from terse letters to sabotaged hunting parties, to, on one memorable occasion, the theft of Lord Pembroke's favorite hound, which had later returned wearing a tiny embroidered blackthorn jacket. Much to everyone. Alistair, ever the dutiful steward, had arranged the feast in hopes of smoothing tensions. The tables groaned with roasted meats, steaming pies, and a centerpiece cheese wheel so large it required 2 servants to carry it in. It was this cheese wheel, alas, that proved to be the evening's undoing. Lord Pembroke accused Lord Blackthorn of serving inferior cheese. Alistair explained, which was objectively untrue. It was an excellent cheese. But then Lord Blackthorn suggested that perhaps Pembroke's palate had been ruined by his habit of drinking vinegar, and, well, Cora's eyes widened. They started a cheese war. Not immediately. First there were insults, then flung goblets. Then the cheese wheel itself was heaved across the table, quite a feat given its size, and that's when the daggers came out. Alistair sighed. I stepped between them, as I always did, trying to calm things down. And for a moment I thought it might work. Lord Pembroke lowered his blade. Lord Blackthorn looked almost embarrassed. Then someone's elbow knocked over a candlestick. The tapestries caught fire. And in the chaos, I found myself quite abruptly stabbed. Cora winced. By accident. By Lord Pembroke. But to be fair, he was aiming for Lord Blackthorn at the time, so I suppose, technically, yes. Alistair expected Cora to laugh at the absurdity of it. Death by misplaced cheese diplomacy, but instead she grew quiet, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "That's not the part that haunts you, though," she said at last. "Is it?" The directness of the question startled him. Ghosts, after all, were meant to be the ones asking haunting questions, not answering them. But Cora had a way of cutting through centuries of self-preservation like a knife through, well, a very soft cheese. "No," he admitted. "It's not." The fire had been spreading rapidly that night, smoke filling the great hall as nobles and servants alike scrambled for the exits. Alistair, bleeding and bewildered, had found himself oddly focused on the most mundane of details. The way the rushes smelled as they smoldered. The pattern of Lord Pembroke's retreating footprints in the spilled wine. He'd been dimly aware of hands grabbing at him, of voices shouting, and then, "Eleanor," he said softly. Cora sat up straighter. "The runaway lady? The one who left the slipper?" Alistair nodded. "She wasn't supposed to be there. hadn't been seen in weeks after her disappearance. But there she was, bursting through the servants' entrance, her hair coming undone from its braids, her face streaked with soot. His voice wavered. She was the castle scribe, and we'd had an understanding. In the chaos, Eleanor had fought her way to his side, ignoring the flames licking at her skirts. When she reached him, she'd gathered him into her arms with a strength that belied her slender frame, her words lost beneath the roar of the fire. But he'd felt them, pressed into his shoulder as she held him. Not like this. Not you too. That embrace, fierce, desperate, smelling of ink and lavender and now smoke, had been the last solid thing he'd ever felt. I died in her arms, Alistair said quietly. And then I wasn't dead. Not quite. I watched her sob, watched her lay me down gently before running for help that would never come in time. And then he gestured to his translucent form. Well, you see the problem. Cora was silent for a long moment. Then you've been trying to hug people ever since. It wasn't a question. Alistair let out a sound that might have been a laugh, if ghosts could properly laugh. Pathetic, isn't it? Centuries of moaning and drifting about, and all I've really wanted is to feel that again, Cora finished. She chewed her lip, then abruptly stood. Right, come here. Alistair blinked. What? You heard me. Up you get. She spread her arms wide. Let's try this. For the first time in 400 years, Alistair found himself at a loss for words. Cora, I can't. Sure you can. Ghosts hug people all the time in stories. Those ghosts are usually trying to strangle. And you're not going to strangle me, are you? Well, no, but... Then stop arguing and give it a go. Hesitantly, Alistair floated to his feet. He'd passed through countless living beings over the centuries. An unpleasant sensation for both parties, but he'd never attempted to hug someone on purpose. He reached out. For one impossible, heart-stopping moment, he thought it might work. Then his arms slipped through Cora like mist through a sieve, leaving only a faint chill where they'd passed. They both looked down at the space where a hug should have been. "Huh," said Cora. Alistair let his arms drop. "Told you." Undeterred, Cora scratched her chin. "Maybe we're approaching this wrong. Ghosts can move objects sometimes, right? Maybe you need to." "It's all right, Cora," Alistair interrupted gently. "Really? I appreciate the effort." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded and sat back down, retrieving her oatcake with a thoughtful air. "For what it's worth," she said after a while, "Eleanor had good taste. You'd have made a terrible ghost, but you must have been a decent steward." Alistair smiled, or did the ghostly equivalent, which mostly involved his edges shimmering slightly. "I like to think so." From somewhere deep in the castle, a mouse squeaked. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and for the first time in centuries, the memory of Eleanor's embrace didn't ache quite so sharply. Cora brushed crumbs from her lap and stood. "Right. Enough moping. Show me that secret passage behind the tapestry, the one with the boar and the dogs. I want to see if it's as disgusting as it sounds." And because it was easier than dwelling, because Cora was somehow both the most infuriating and most wonderful person he'd met in death, Alistair did. Chapter 6. Modern Tourists. New Hope, New Fears. The day Blackthorn Keep opened to the public was the most exciting day of Alistair's afterlife. After centuries of neglect, the crumbling castle had been deemed historically significant by some bureaucratic entity, and with that designation came guided tours, informational plaques, and, most importantly, a constant stream of living, breathing people. For the first time in 400 years, Alistair wouldn't have to wait months between human interactions. They would come to him willingly, even eagerly. Cora, who had somehow appointed herself the castle's unofficial ghost liaison, a position that mostly involved arguing with historians about where to place the gift shop, had warned him to temper his expectations. "They're tourists, Alistair," she'd said, watching workers install a revolving postcard rack in what had once been the dungeon. "They want spooky stories and cool photos. They don't actually want to meet you." But Alistair couldn't help his optimism. These were modern people, after all. They had ghost hunting shows and spirit boxes, and all manner of gadgets designed specifically for communicating with the dead. Surely, among the hundreds of visitors who would pass through Blackthorn Keep's gates, at least one would be willing to have a conversation. The first tour group arrived on a drizzly Tuesday morning, led by a university student named Mark, whose name tag identified him as Castle Guide Trainee. Alistair, vibrating with excitement, positioned himself at the top of the grand staircase, a prime spot for dramatic appearances. As Mark droned on about the castle's architectural features, note the late medieval crenellations, which were mostly decorative by this period, Alistair cleared his throat and said, "Actually, those were added after the siege of 1387. What emerged was his usual ghostly moan. "Ha, actually, thus we're..." The effect was immediate. A woman in the back screamed. A man dropped his camera. Mark, the trainee guide, to his credit, only went pale and stammered, As I was saying, the castle is said to be haunted by, several spirits," before herding the group away at a speed just shy of a full sprint. Alistair spent the rest of the day drifting disconsolately through the gift shop, where his presence made the electronic cash register glitch in interesting ways. By week's end, however, he'd developed a new strategy. If he couldn't speak to the tourist, perhaps he could communicate through more subtle means. He practiced moving dust particles into shapes, first simple arrows pointing to interesting architectural details, then, ambitiously, words. His first attempt at hello had looked more like HELP, which explained why that particular tour group had abandoned their guide entirely. Then came the selfie incident. Alistair had noticed that modern visitors seemed obsessed with capturing their own images against historical backdrops. A group of teenagers was posing in the Great Hall, taking turns making exaggerated spooked faces while their friend snapped photos. Seizing the opportunity, Alistair had drifted into frame behind them, giving what he hoped was a friendly wave. The resulting photograph, in which Alistair appeared as a pale, grinning specter looming ominously over the teen's shoulders, went viral on some infernal modern platform called SpookTok. Within days, Blackthorn Keep was overrun with influencers, paranormal investigators, and at least one woman who claimed to be a spirit medium, but whose only apparent talent was identifying which corners of the castle got the best lighting for Instagram posts. Cora, watching from the sidelines with increasing amusement, finally took pity on him. "You're trying too hard," she said as Alistair attempted, and failed, to levitate a pamphlet about the castle's history into a teenager's backpack. "These people don't want a friendly ghost. They want a story to tell at parties." "But I don't want to scare them," Alistair protested, his voice making a nearby light bulb flicker. Cora grinned. "Then you're in the wrong line of work, mate." The final straw came with the arrival of the professional ghost hunters, a team of 3 who called themselves the Spectral Investigators, and whose equipment consisted largely of devices that beeped randomly while they shouted questions into empty rooms. Alistair, despite his better judgment, had been excited. Here, at last, were people actively seeking ghostly contact. He hovered eagerly as they set up in the banquet hall, their cameras rolling. When one investigator dramatically called out, "If there's a spirit here, give us a sign," Alistair rushed to comply, gently tapping a candlestick on the table. The candlestick, untouched by human hands, wobbled slightly. The investigators screamed. Not a dignified professional scream. Not even the startled yelp of someone genuinely surprised. This was full-bodied, limb-flailing terror, complete with one man tripping over his own tripod, and another throwing a handful of salt in a panic, most of which passed harmlessly through Alistair and landed on the team leader's shoes. Within minutes, they'd packed up their equipment and fled, later uploading footage titled "Demonic Entity Attack at Haunted Castle, Not Clickbait" to their channel. Alistair, watching their retreat from an upper window, felt the ghostly equivalent of a headache coming on. "That could have gone better," Cora observed, appearing at his side with a fresh oatcake. "I tapped a candlestick," Alistair moaned. "He tapped it." Cora patted the air where his shoulder would have been. "Look on the bright side. At least you're famous now." Alistair groaned, a sound that made the castle's new emergency exit sign short-circuit. Below them, another tour group gathered, their phones already raised in anticipation. Somewhere in the crowd, a child asked, "Mum, can ghosts follow you home?" Alistair sighed. 400 years of loneliness, and this was his afterlife, reduced to a jump scare in someone's vacation video. Still, as he watched the tourists file in, their faces alight with equal parts fear and fascination, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something resembling satisfaction. They might not talk to him. They might not even like him. But for the first time in centuries, people were coming to Blackthorn Keep because of him. That, at least, was something. Then a teenager in a Ion Ghosts t-shirts screamed at nothing in particular. And Alistair remembered why he missed the mice. Chapter 7. The Viral Ghost Selfie Incident. It had begun, as so many disasters do, with the best of intentions. A young couple, Oliver and Sophie, according to their bickering, had been attempting to take a romantic selfie in Blackthorn Keep's famed Whispering Gallery, where the acoustics allegedly carried declarations of love straight to heaven, or at least straight to the gift shop, depending on which tour guide you ask. Alistair, hovering nearby and feeling uncharacteristically playful, had decided to photobomb their picture by making a silly face behind them. He had forgotten, of course, that his silly face translated to the living world as a ghastly rictus grin floating in midair. The resulting photograph showed Oliver and Sophie smiling sweetly at the camera, unaware of the spectral horror looming behind them, its hollow eyes seeming to bore into their very souls. Sophie had screamed when she reviewed the image. Oliver had fainted directly onto a display of commemorative shot glasses. By the time they regained their composure, the photo had already been uploaded to every paranormal forum, social media platform, and clickbait news site in existence. The caption, "Coast photobombs our engagement pic," had been shared over 100,000 times before lunch. Cora, who had developed an unholy fascination with modern technology since the castle got Wi-Fi, tracked the photo's spread with gleeful horror. "You're trending," she informed Alistair, waving her phone at him. "There are memes. Someone's made you into a reaction gif. The Daily Mail thinks you're a Victorian child murderer." Alistair groaned, a sound that made all the light bulbs in the gift shop explode simultaneously. "I was trying to look friendly." "Well," said Cora, scrolling through her feed, "you succeeded in scaring the entire internet. This one says you're proof of the afterlife. This one says you're a government hologram. Oh, this conspiracy theorist thinks you're an alien." The sudden influx of attention transformed Blackthorn Keep overnight. Where before the modest groups of history enthusiasts and the occasional ghost tour, now there were mobs of smartphone-wielding visitors elbowing each other for the perfect ghost selfie. The castle's staff, unprepared for fame, struggled to maintain order as influencers staged elaborate photo shoots in the dungeons and amateur paranormal investigators set up infrared cameras in the privies. Alistair, overwhelmed, took to hiding in the castle's least visited spaces. The old buttery, the abandoned chapel, once in desperation, inside a suit of armor that turned out to be a popular backdrop for TikTok dances. But there was no escape. Everywhere he went, someone was waiting with a camera, hoping to capture the ghost that photobombs. The breaking point came when a particularly enterprising YouTuber attempted to summon Alistair using a homemade spirit box constructed from a broken radio and a salad spinner. Trapped in a corner as the man waved his contraption around, chanting, "Show yourself, ghost bro," Alistair finally snapped. With great effort, he focused all his spectral energy into one tremendous, echoing moan. The sound shook the walls, rattled the windows, and sent the YouTuber scrambling for the exit so quickly he left his shoes behind. The video, titled "Angry Ghost Attacks Me for Real, Emotional," would go on to garner 2 million views. "That's it," Alistair declared, drifting into the castle's administrative office where Cora was arguing with the site manager about fire codes. "I'm retiring from public life." Cora barely glanced up from her paperwork. "Bit late for that. You've been nominated for Supernatural Selfie of the Year." "I don't even know what that means." "It means you're famous, mate. Might as well lean into it." She grinned. "I've been talking to marketing. We're thinking about ghost-themed merchandise. Maybe a cutout where people can pose with you." Alistair stared at her. "You're joking. 80% of the gift shop revenue could go toward castle restoration. Think of the historical preservation." The words struck a chord. Alistair hesitated. "What sort of cutout?" "Life-sized, with your best side." "I don't have sides. I'm translucent." Cora waved a hand. "Semantics. Point is, you could do some good with this. Scare kids into learning history, fund some proper research into the castle's archives, maybe even get Eleanor's story told properly." The mention of Eleanor gave Alistair pause. Centuries after her disappearance, her fate remained one of Blackthorn Keep's great mysteries. One the official tours glossed over in favor of more marketable hauntings. He sighed, a sound that made the office plants shiver. "Fine, but no bubbleheads. Not even little ones that glow in the dark. Especially not those." Outside, another tour group passed by, their phones raised high. A child's voice floated through the window. "Mummy? Is the friendly ghost here today?" Alistair and Cora exchanged a look. "You know," Cora mused, "we could probably charge extra for guaranteed ghost sightings." Alistair groaned again, but this time just one light bulb flickered. Progress of a sort. Chapter 8. Enter the paranormal investigators. The team arrived in matching black t-shirts emblazoned with their logo, a cartoon ghost being zapped by a lightning bolt, under the words "Spectral Showdown." Their van, which looked like it had been stolen from a 1980s crime drama, was covered in decals of haunted locations and what appeared to be a poorly drawn demon. Alistair, watching from the castle's highest tower, felt a deep and profound sense of dread settle over him. Cora, leaning against the battlement next to him, squinted at the newcomers. "Oh, this is going to be good." The team consisted of 3 individuals. Dave, the self-proclaimed tech guru, whose equipment belt held enough blinking devices to launch a small satellite. Lisa, the sensitive, who claimed to communicate with spirits through her dreams, and also, apparently, through a stuffed owl named Mr. Hoots. And their leader, Brent, whose muscles seemed to be in a constant battle with his shirt sleeves. "Remember," Cora muttered as the team unloaded their gear, "these people think ghosts are either evil entities or reality TV stars. There is no in-between." Alistair sighed, making the nearby weather vane spin wildly. "I just want someone to talk to. Is that so difficult?" Down in the courtyard, Brent was already setting up a tripod with a camera that looked like it could see through time. "All right, team," he announced. "This place is crawling with paranormal activity. We're talking full-bodied apparitions, disembodied voices, the works. Our mission? Document everything. And if things get hairy..." He pulled a spray bottle from his belt. "Holy water. Extra strength." Lisa clutched Mr. Hoots to her chest. The spirits are restless today. Mr. Hoot says we should be careful. Dave adjusted his headset. Thermal cameras a go. EMF readers primed. Let's ghost hunt. Alistair groaned. This is going to be a disaster. The team's investigation began in the Great Hall, where Brent immediately began shouting questions at the rafters. Spirit, show yourself. Are you the restless soul of a murdered servant? Fallen knight? Steward, Alistair muttered from the corner. What was that? Brent whirled around, nearly knocking over Lisa, who had begun swaying with her eyes closed. I heard something, Dave whispered, staring at his EMF reader, which was beeping erratically. The energy is off the charts. Alistair, who had merely been trying to correct Brent's assumption, floated closer. Look, Lisa gasped. He's here. I can feel him. Mr. Hoot says he's confused. Alistair threw up his hands. Of course I'm confused. You're all yelling. The words came out as a bone-rattling moan that sent Dave scrambling backward into a suit of armor, which toppled with a crash. Brent whipped out his holy water and began spraying in random directions, most of which passed harmlessly through Alistair and onto Dave's equipment. Stop that, Alistair protested, swatting at the droplets. Lisa screamed. He's angry. The spirit is angry. I'm not angry, I'm exasperated. Brent pulled out a digital recorder. Spirit, tell us your name. Alistair groaned. Alistair. My name is Alistair. The recorder caught only a garbled, demonic-sounding growl. Dave's eyes widened. It's speaking in tongues. This is unbelievable. Cora, who had been observing from the doorway, snorted. Oh, it's unbelievable, all right. Alistair turned to her, exasperated. Can you please explain to them that I'm not some malevolent entity? Cora smirked. Where's the fun in that? Brent, emboldened by the activity, began a dramatic monologue for the camera. We are clearly dealing with a Class 4 apparition here, possibly demonic. The energy in this room is... Alistair had had enough. He reached out and gently tipped over a candlestick on the table. The team froze. Then, as one, they screamed and bolted for the door, tripping over each other in their haste. Brent dropped his holy water. Lisa abandoned Mr. Hoot's. Dave's headset got tangled in a tapestry, which he took as a sign of supernatural interference, and promptly ripped free, leaving a sizable hole in the centuries-old fabric. Silence fell over the great hall. Cora picked up the discarded stuffed owl and dusted it off. Well, that could have gone better. Alistair slumped onto the nearest chair, or rather, through it. I give up. Clearly, the only thing people want from a ghost is a cheap scare. Cora tossed Mr. Hoots onto the table. Or, she said thoughtfully, we lean into it. Alistair frowned. What do you mean? She grinned. If they want a show, we give them a show, but on our terms. Alistair eyed her warily. This feels like a terrible idea. Probably, but it's better than hiding in the walls every time someone shows up with a camera. Outside, the team could be heard arguing about whether to call an exorcist or just burn the castle down. Alistair sighed. Fine, but no more stuffed animals. Cora held up her hands. No promises. And so, as the spectral showdown team regrouped in the courtyard, completely unaware of the chaos they were about to unleash, Alistair prepared for his greatest performance yet. If the world wanted a ghost story, he'd give them one they'd never forget. Chapter 9. The Exorcism Debacle. Brent from Spectral Showdown returned to Blackthorn Keep 3 days later with reinforcements. A self-styled ecclesiastical paranormal consultant named Father Donovan, who appeared to be wearing more amulets than actual clothing, and a nervous-looking cameraman who kept muttering about overtime pay. They set up in the great hall where Lisa had apparently sensed the strongest demonic presence, though Alistair had been napping in the wine cellar at the time. Cora watched the preparations from the minstrel's gallery while absently chewing on one of the oatcakes she always carried. "They've brought sage," she observed as Father Donovan began unpacking what looked like a small apothecary's worth of herbs and candles. "And is that—" "A turkey baster full of holy water." Alistair materialized beside her, squinting at the spectacle below. "I don't understand why they insist on this demon narrative. I told them my name was Alistair. I was a steward. I kept impeccable records." Down in the hall, Brent was explaining to the camera that they were dealing with a Class 7 non-corporeal entity with clear demonic attachments. Father Donovan nodded gravely while lighting black candles that smelled suspiciously of pumpkin spice. The first attempt at exorcism began with Father Donovan chanting in what he claimed was Aramaic, but sounded suspiciously like someone trying to order a kebab while drunk. He waved his smoking sage bundle in wide arcs, filling the hall with enough smoke to make the fire alarms consider early retirement. Alistair, curious despite himself, drifted closer. "Spirit of darkness," intoned Father Donovan, "I command you to reveal yourself." Alistair sighed. "I'm right here." His words emerged as the usual ghostly moan, sending the cameraman scrambling backward into a suit of armor for the second time that week. "Here," bellowed Brent, spraying holy water from his turkey baster in wild arcs. One stream passed straight through Alistair and hit Father Donovan square in the face. Father Donovan spluttered. "That was me, you idiot." Alistair, seeing an opportunity, gently lifted one of the black candles with his limited telekinetic ability, a skill he'd been practicing lately, mostly to turn pages in the castle's guest book. The candle floated about 2 feet off the table before dropping with a splatter of wax. Lisa screamed. "It's attacking the sacred implements." "I was trying to help," Alistair protested, but his voice just made the chandelier sway, ominously. Father Donovan, wiping holy water from his eyes, launched into another round of chanting while sprinkling salt in a circle around himself. This might have been more impressive if he hadn't tripped over his own ceremonial robe halfway through, sending salt flying everywhere. Brent turned to the camera. "As you can see, the entity is resisting our cleansing attempts with extreme violence." Alistair groaned and sank through the floor into the kitchen below, where Cora had wisely retreated to raid the gift shop's snack supply. She looked up as he materialized through the ceiling. "Giving up already?" "They're impossible," Alistair moaned, making the teacups rattle in their display case. "I try to help, and they think I'm attacking. I say hello, and they spray me with holy water. That turkey bastard went straight through my spleen." Cora considered this while unwrapping a chocolate bar. "You know, most ghosts would lean into this. Play the villain, give them a proper show." "But I don't want to be the villain," Alistair said, drifting forlornly around the room. "I just want someone to talk to me like a person. Was that candle thing really so scary?" Upstairs, a loud crash suggested Father Donovan had knocked over his entire makeshift altar. Someone screamed something about demonic winds, though the castle was famously drafty on the best of days. Cora licked chocolate from her fingers. "Tell you what, if you promise not to mope through any more walls today, I'll introduce you to someone who might actually listen." Alistair perked up. "Who?" "Old Tom, the groundskeeper. He's been working here 40 years, claims he's seen you dozens of times. Says you once helped him find his missing wrench." "I did do that," Alistair admitted. "It was under the hedge by the east tower. I tried to tell him, but he ran away before I could finish pointing." Cora stood and brushed crumbs from her trousers. "Well, he's retired now, but he still comes by on Tuesdays to yell at the new gardeners. Might be your best shot at a civil conversation with a living person." From upstairs came the sound of breaking glass, followed by Father Donovan shouting what sounded like a Latin swear word. Alistair watched as a trickle of holy water dripped through the ceiling. "At this point, I'll take what I can get." That evening, after the paranormal team had fled, leaving behind most of their equipment and all of their dignity, Alistair hovered by the castle gates waiting for old Tom's weekly visit. The air smelled of trampled sage and regret. Somewhere in the distance a car alarm wailed, almost certainly Brent's van. Cora was right about one thing, Alistair reflected. If people wanted a ghost story, he'd give them one. But on his terms. Starting with one very confused but open-minded groundskeeper. And if that didn't work, well, there was always the turkey baster. Chapter 10. The Chaotic Séance. The notice appeared on Blackthorn Keep's official Twitter account, managed against all logic by Cora. Special event, Victorian Séance experience. Authentic spirit communication in the castle's haunted Great Hall. Limited tickets available. Alistair only learned about it when he drifted through the gift shop and saw the promotional flyers featuring a poorly photoshopped image of his ghostly face hovering over a crystal ball. This seems ill-advised, he said to Cora, who was busy stocking a new line of Ainon Ghosts merchandise. Cora barely glanced up from arranging glow-in-the-dark keychains. Come on, it'll be fun. We'll do it properly. Dim lighting, round table, the works. You can finally talk to people without them screaming. Mostly. I make electronics malfunction, Alistair pointed out. That's why we're going Victorian. No electronics, just good old-fashioned spookiness. She held up an antique-looking brass horn. See, even got a proper speaking trumpet. Alistair eyed the trumpet warily. That's a gramophone horn you've spray-painted gold. Details. The night of the séance arrived with appropriate atmosphere. A howling wind rattling the castle windows, intermittent rain, and at least one startled bat that had wandered in through the chimney. 12 guests had paid premium prices for the experience, including a skeptical university parapsychology student taking notes, 2 elderly sisters who clutched each other at every creak, and a man in a top hat who had brought his own Ouija board just in case. Cora, playing the role of medium with unsettling enthusiasm, had draped herself in enough scarves to outfit a Victorian ghost hunting party. She dimmed the gas lamps, installed last month for authenticity, and arranged the guests around an ancient oak table that had once hosted far bloodier gatherings. We gather tonight, she intoned, to commune with the spirits of Blackthorn Keep, particularly one spirit, a lonely soul who walks these halls seeking connection. She shot Alistair a look where he hovered near the fireplace. Try not to moan this time. Use the trumpet. Alistair sighed and drifted toward the gold-sprayed gramophone horn. He'd been practicing all week, focusing his energy to produce something approximating intelligible speech through the acoustic amplifier. Cora placed her hands dramatically on the table. Spirit of Blackthorn Keep, are you with us? Alistair concentrated and spoke into the trumpet. Yes, hello. What emerged was still ghostly, but remarkably clear, like a badly tuned radio broadcast from 1922. The effect was immediate. The skeptical student dropped his pen. The sisters gasped in unison. The man in the top hat muttered, "I knew it," and produced a notebook from his coat. Cora beamed. Spirit, can you tell us your name? My name is Alistair. I was steward here in the 14th century. The words vibrated through the horn with only slight distortion. This was working. Actually working. For the first time in centuries, living people were hearing him and not running away. Alistair felt something like excitement bubbling up, which, unfortunately for the electronics in the vicinity, was exactly the wrong emotional state. The first casualty was the university student's digital recorder, which emitted a sad beep before dying completely. Then the emergency exit sign above the door flickered ominously. Ask him why he haunts this place, one of the sisters whispered. Cora relayed the question. Alistair, caught up in the moment, forgot to use the trumpet. I just want someone to talk to, he blurted directly. His unrestrained voice hit the room like a sonic boom. Every light bulb in the great hall exploded simultaneously. The fake gas lamps flickered out. Someone's smartphone, left on the table, made a sound like a dying robot before its screen went black. In the pitch darkness, chaos erupted. The sisters screamed. The student shouted something about electromagnetic fields. The Ouija board enthusiast fell backward off his chair. Somewhere in the confusion, Cora could be heard yelling, "That's authentic Victorian séance experience for you." Alistair, horrified, tried to apologize, but his attempts only made the chandelier sway violently, and several guests' watches stopped working permanently. By the time Cora got the emergency lanterns lit, the séance had dissolved into pandemonium. The sisters were clutching each other and praying loudly. The student was furiously scribbling in his notebook under the light of his now defunct phone. The top hat man had somehow produced a vial of salt and was flinging it in random directions. Cora clapped her hands. Everyone remain calm. The spirit means no harm. He's just enthusiastic. I'm sorry, Alistair moaned through the trumpet, which was now emitting sparks. I got excited. The resulting energy surge blew out the castle's entire electrical system. Down in the gift shop, the cash register began printing receipts uncontrollably. Up in the tower, the newly installed Wi-Fi router burst into flames, briefly. As staff members ran about with flashlights and fire extinguishers, Cora turned to where Alistair hovered guiltily near the ceiling. "Well," she said, "good news is we can definitely charge more for the next one." Alistair groaned, causing the lantern flames to dance wildly. "There won't be a next one. Look at them." The guests were indeed a sorry sight, disheveled, wide-eyed, and in some cases missing crucial pieces of technology. But then something remarkable happened. The university student stood up. "That," he said with growing excitement, "was the most genuine paranormal encounter ever documented. The EMF spikes, the voice phenomena, the coordinated electrical failures." He turned to Cora. "When's your next event? I need to bring my department chair." One of the sisters, still shaking, nodded fervently. "We're coming too. Elsie hasn't had this much fun since her hip operation." The top hat man adjusted his now crooked headwear. "I have questions about the 14th century tax policies. The spirit seems like he'd know." Cora grinned at Alistair. "Told you they'd love it." As the guests filed out, receiving complimentary "I survived the Blackthorn Séance" t-shirts, Alistair realized something extraordinary. For the first time since his death, people weren't afraid of him. They were interested, even if it had taken blowing up half the castle's electronics to get there. Later, as electricians swarmed the property and Cora counted the night's profits, Alistair hovered by the repaired trumpet, practicing his modulated ghost voice. Maybe next time, with enough focus, he could get through a whole sentence without causing a blackout. And if not, well, Blackthorn Keep's fire extinguishers were up to date. Probably. Chapter 11. A Ghost's Guide to Medieval Interior Design. The castle renovations began in earnest after the séance incident, partly to repair the electrical systems Alistair had fried, and partly because the sudden influx of paranormal tourism had given Blackthorn Keep's budget more zeros than it had seen since the 15th century wool trade. Alistair found himself strangely invested in the process, drifting through scaffolding and dodging painters with the air of a particularly fussy project manager. "This," he declared to Cora one afternoon, "is an abomination." He was referring to the newly installed gift shop extension in the East Tower, where tasteful stone arches had been replaced with what the architect called a seamless retail integration experience, and Alistair called a crime against masonry. Cora, sitting atop a pile of freshly delivered tapestries, machine-washable, medieval-inspired designs, shrugged. "It's progress. People want souvenirs. Also, the old tower was literally crumbling. That's what gives it character," Alistair protested, waving a translucent hand at the offending structure. "Do you know how many generations of Blackthorns drunkenly stumbled up those crumbling steps? That's history. So smallpox, but we don't miss that either." Cora unfolded one of the tapestries, revealing a garishly colored scene of knights fighting what appeared to be neon green dragons. "What do you think?" The designer called it medieval fantasy fusion. Alistair made a sound like a deflating bagpipe. "That's not a tapestry. That's a visual assault. Where are the hunting scenes? The intricate floral borders? The subtle heraldic symbolism? Probably in a museum. These are for tourists who think medieval means Game of Thrones. Alistair sighed, making the nearby paint cans vibrate ominously. Painters had learned to ignore such occurrences, though they still crossed themselves when no one was looking. Modern people have no appreciation for proper interior decoration. Do you know how long it took to choose just the right tapestries for the Great Hall? Months. And that was before accounting for the smell. Cora blinked. The smell? Well, tapestries fresh from Flanders had a particular barnyard aroma. The castle steward's ledger from 1389 lists 6 pounds of rosewater, purchased specifically to make the new hangings less likely to gag visitors. Alistair drifted toward one of the remaining original tapestries, its threads faded but still depicting a boar hunt with remarkable detail. This one was Eleanor's favorite. She said the hounds looked like they were having more fun than the hunters. Cora's expression softened. We could keep this one, put a little plaque next to it or something. Alistair studied the tapestry. It seemed so familiar he could have traced them from memory. The red-haired hunter in the corner who always reminded him of Eleanor's brother. The mischievous-looking hound that had escaped its embroidered leash in one corner. The tiny, barely visible mouse hiding in the foliage that only he seemed to notice. That would be acceptable, he said finally. Their tour of the renovations continued, with Alistair offering running commentary on every change. The new LED torch sconces. Why does everything have to flicker? Real torches smoked properly. The historically inaccurate but very comfortable guest benches at least carve some gargoyles on the legs. The emergency exit signs? Couldn't they be shaped like heraldic banners? The kitchen remodel drew particular scorn. They've made it all open concept. Alistair moaned, drifting through what had once been a solid wall. Half the fun of a medieval kitchen was not knowing whether your stew contained meat or a careless scullion's finger until you bit into it. Cora snorted. Health and safety regulations disagree. It's the principle of the thing. Mystery. Suspense. Genuine surprise in every bowl. By the time they reached the newly designated Spectral Séance chamber, formerly the castle's least haunted storage closet, Alistair was in full medieval decorator mode. This is all wrong for spirit communication. Where's the proper ominous atmosphere? The subtle play of shadows? You need heavy drapery, not this IKEA dungeon sheet. Cora rubbed her temples. I regret giving you design opinions. I'm a ghost, Cora. Interior design is literally the only hobby I have left. This, at least, was undeniably true. Over 6 centuries, Alistair had developed very specific opinions about castle aesthetics. Rushes should be changed seasonally, not left to become miniature ecosystems. While sconces should be placed precisely 7 feet apart for optimal illumination. And tapestries, always tapestries, were superior to paintings for their warmth, their noise-dampening qualities, and their ability to conceal secret passages, and the occasional drunken noble. As they passed through the great hall, now dotted with informational displays about the castle's ghostly residents, Alistair rated an entire panel titled The Tragic Steward. A group of tourists gasped at his sudden appearance. Unlike previous visitors, however, these simply grabbed their phones and began filming. Look, it's the friendly ghost, a child shouted. Alistair, torn between irritation at being called friendly and delight at not being screamed at, settled for a dignified nod, which unfortunately translated as his head briefly rotating 180 degrees before correcting itself. The tourists applauded. See? Cora whispered as they floated away. Fame suits you. Alistair harumphed, making a nearby display of replica goblets tremble. I was an excellent steward. I kept meticulous records. I mediated disputes. I once negotiated a peace treaty over undercooked venison, and now I'm reduced to this. He gestured to his translucent form. "A party trick for tourists." Cora patted the air near his shoulder. "You're also the reason we can afford to restore the original Tapestries. The conservation team starts next week." Alistair froze. "You're joking." "Nope. Full preservation treatment on the 3 remaining medieval pieces. Acid-free backing, climate-controlled display cases, the works." She grinned. "Turns out Haunted Castle with authentic 14th century decor tests really well, with focus groups." For a moment, Alistair was speechless, a rare state for any ghost, let alone one as opinionated as himself. The thought of Eleanor's favorite tapestry being properly cared for, of visitors appreciating the craftsmanship he'd admired for centuries, made something inside him unclench. Then a workman walked by, carrying a neon ghost selfie spot sign, and the moment passed. "At least make them put the signs in Gothic font," he grumbled, drifting away to haunt the gift shop's new historical accuracy complaint box. After all, some traditions were worth maintaining, even in the afterlife. Chapter 12. The Final Attempt at Affection. The historian arrived on a crisp autumn morning, when the castle grounds were carpeted in gold and scarlet leaves that crunched satisfyingly underfoot. Dr. Eleanor Wren, a coincidence of names that made Alistair's spectral heart clench, had been granted special access to Blackthorn Keep's archives to study 14th century estate management. Cora had mentioned her arrival days in advance, casually noting the historian's expertise in medieval household accounts. Alistair had lingered near the library all morning, watching through the leaded glass as the woman worked. She had Eleanor's coloring, the same auburn hair, though pulled back in a modern ponytail rather than braided, the same faint freckles across her nose. But it was the way she handled the ancient ledgers that truly undid him. Fingers gentle on the vellum, pausing to trace marginal notes with something like affection, just as his Eleanor had done centuries ago. "You're staring," Cora observed, appearing at his side with 2 oatcakes. She offered one to Alistair out of habit, then remembered and ate it herself when he shook his head. "She's reading my accounts," Alistair murmured. "The ones I kept after the harvest of 1388. See how she smiles at the entry about the missing cheese." Cora squinted through the window. "I think that's more of a confused frown." "She understands them," Alistair insisted. "Truly understands. Look how she checks the feast records against the kitchen inventories. Eleanor used to say." He broke off, the memory suddenly too sharp. Cora studied him quietly for a moment. "You could talk to her, use the speaking trumpet. She's a historian, probably the one person alive who wouldn't run screaming from a chatty ghost." Alistair watched as Dr. Wren carefully turned a page, her fingers barely touching the edges. The morning light caught the dust motes swirling around her, making her seem momentarily insubstantial, too. "I could," he agreed. But something deeper than words pulled at him. 600 years of drifting through walls, of watching living hands pass through his form, of longing for the simple human contact he'd lost in that smoke-filled hall. The seances and ghost tours had proven people would talk to him, but no one would touch a ghost. Not unless the ghost made himself real. The idea came to him fully formed, as if whispered by the castle itself. If he concentrated all his energy, all his lingering ties to the physical world, he could manifest completely. Briefly. Just long enough for— "Whatever you're thinking, stop," Cora said sharply, reading his expression. "That look never ends well. Last time you got that look, we had to replace all the light fixtures in the West Wing." Alistair shook his head. "I need to try something." Before Cora could protest further, he drifted toward the library door. His form flickered as he gathered his energy, pulling himself tighter, more substantial. Centuries of practice had taught him how to appear nearly solid when needed, how to lift a single sheet of parchment or tap a candlestick. But what he planned now required far more. Dr. Wren looked up as the temperature in the library dropped suddenly, her breath visible in the autumn-warmed room. Her eyes widened as Alistair materialized before her. Not the usual translucent shimmer, but something almost flesh, the ghostly approximation of the man he'd once been. "Hello," he said, and miraculously, His voice was nearly normal, just faintly echoing as if from down a long hallway. The historian stood slowly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. To her credit, she didn't scream. "You're the steward, Alistair." She gestured to the ledger before her. "I've been reading your work. Your crop rotation system was revolutionary for the period." Alistair felt something like pride swell in his chest. "The barley yields increased 40%, he said, taking a step closer, though the kitchen staff complained about losing their usual thieving opportunities. Dr. Wren laughed, a bright, surprised sound that reminded him painfully of long-ago afternoons in this very room. Encouraged, he took another step. He could feel the tremendous effort of maintaining this form, like holding up a collapsing ceiling with sheer willpower. But it was working. She was looking at him, talking to him, seeing him as a person rather than a spectacle. And then, because he had to know, because 6 centuries was too long to go without, Alistair reached out. The historian froze as his hand, nearly opaque now, came to rest on her arm. For one glorious, impossible moment he felt it. The warmth of living skin through the wool of her cardigan, the slight give of flesh over bone. Contact, dote. Real, actual contact, after centuries of nothing. Then Dr. Wren screamed. Not the startled yelp of the tourists or the dramatic shrieks of the ghost hunters. This was pure, primal terror. The sound of a human confronted with something that defied all natural laws. She wrenched backward, toppling her chair, the ancient ledger nearly tumbling to the floor before Alistair caught it with a flick of his remaining energy. The damage was done. The historian scrambled for the door, still screaming, her previously academic interest in the supernatural clearly not extending to physical encounters with it. Alistair's form wavered, his hard-won solidity unraveling like mist in sunlight. Cora burst into the library just as Dr. Wren fled past her. "What's in the—" She took in the scene, the toppled chair, the floating ledger, Alistair's rapidly dissipating form. "Oh, you idiot! You absolute moron! You tried to touch her?" Alistair let the ledger settle gently on the table. "I did touch her," he whispered. For a second. Cora ran a hand over her face. "She's currently hyperventilating in the gift shop. The staff think she saw a mouse." "A mouse," Alistair repeated dully. "Would you prefer I told them the truth? That the castle ghost just assaulted a visiting academic?" "It wasn't assault. It was a hug. Or it would have been if she'd let me finish." Cora groaned. "You can't go around grabbing historians, Alistair. That's how you get exorcised. Like, properly exorcised. Not just Brent with his turkey bastard." The weight of his mistake settled over Alistair as heavily as the chains some ghosts supposedly wore. He'd risked everything, his tenuous place at Blackthorn Keep, his hard-won acceptance from the living world, for one moment of connection. And it had worked. And it had been a disaster. "Will she come back?" he asked softly. Cora hesitated. "To finish her research? Probably. Medieval agricultural records aren't exactly common. But she'll likely bring company. And garlic. Possibly." Alistair drifted to the window, watching as Dr. Wren hurried across the courtyard below, casting fearful glances back at the castle. A group of tourists parted around her, their ghost tours suddenly seeming much less entertaining in the face of genuine terror. "I felt her," Alistair murmured. "Just for a second, but I'd forgotten what warmth felt like." Cora's expression softened. She moved to stand beside him, careful not to look directly at his translucent form. "I know." They watched together as the historian disappeared through the castle gates, the autumn leaves swirling in her wake. Somewhere in the distance a bell tolled, the village church marking the hour, as it had for centuries. Alistair let his form fade further, conserving what little energy he had left. "I think I'm done trying," he said at last. Cora didn't argue. For once she had no quick remark, No clever solution. Just silent companionship as the afternoon light slanted through the library windows, illuminating dust motes that might have been ghosts themselves, floating aimlessly through eternity. Outside, the first cold winds of winter began to stir. Chapter 13. The Bishop's Overzealous Blessing. Dr. Eleanor Wren did in fact return to Blackthorn Keep, though not in the manner Alistair might have hoped. 3 days after the disastrous library incident, she arrived flanked by no fewer than 6 serious-looking clergymen, led by a particularly enthusiastic bishop whose embroidered vestments flapped dramatically in the autumn wind like the sails of some vengeful spiritual warship. Cora intercepted them at the gates, arms crossed, looking deeply unimpressed. "Let me guess," she said, eyeing the bishop's ornate staff, which appeared to have been dipped in enough holy water to drown a small village. "You're here about the ghost." Bishop Atticus Thorne drew himself up to his full height, which was considerable. "We are here," he boomed, "to cleanse this unholy place of its demonic infestation." Behind him, the other clergyman nodded solemnly, while Dr. Wren hovered awkwardly near the back, clutching her research notes like a shield. Cora sighed. "Right. Well, good luck with that. Just don't touch the tapestries. They're newly restored." Alistair, watching invisibly from the battlements, felt a curious mixture of resignation and irritation. 6 centuries of failed exorcisms had left him largely unconcerned about holy water and Latin incantations. But there was something uniquely galling about being declared an unholy infestation by a man whose hat probably cost more than a medieval peasant earned in a lifetime. The bishop's procession swept through the castle like a particularly devout tornado, swinging censers that filled the halls with enough incense to choke a less determined spirit. They paused periodically to fling holy water at suspicious shadows, most of which were, in fact, just shadows, and to loudly command any nefarious entities to reveal themselves. Alistair followed at a safe distance, occasionally reaching out to make a candle flicker or drapery sway, just enough to keep things interesting. When the group reached the library, he couldn't resist drifting through the wall directly behind the bishop, momentarily giving the impression that the clergyman's elaborate hat had developed ghostly afterimages. "It shows itself," thundered Bishop Thorne, spinning around and nearly braining one of his assistants with the holy water dispenser. Dr. Wren, to her credit, looked more embarrassed than afraid now. "Actually, Your Grace, historical records suggest the spirit, Alistair, was known to be quite benign. The accounts mention him helping locate lost items and even preventing a kitchen fire in. Nonsense." The bishop waved away 6 centuries of relatively peaceful coexistence. No soul remains earthbound without nefarious purpose. This so-called Alistair is clearly a demon in disguise, biding its time. Alistair, who had been floating near the ceiling, contemplating the bishop's hat's aerodynamic properties, snorted at this. The sound emerged as an unfortunate combination of a death rattle and a poorly tuned pipe organ, causing 2 clergymen to drop their prayer books. Seizing the moment, Bishop Thorne launched into the full exorcism rite with gusto. Not content with the standard liturgy, he appeared to be pulling out every obscure blessing, curse, and holy injunction he'd ever heard of, including several phrases that sounded suspiciously like bad Latin translations of gardening advice. "Exorcizo te, omnis spiritus immunde," he bellowed, splashing holy water in a wide arc. "Per diem vivum, per diem ferrum, per doium, o an sanctum." Alistair drifted lazily through the spray, more annoyed than threatened. Centuries of this sort of thing had left him with excellent holy water avoidance reflexes. He was about to retreat to the wine cellar to wait out the spectacle when something peculiar happened. Bishop Thorne, reaching the dramatic climax of his rite, produced a small silver reliquary from his robe. "Behold the relic of St. Cuthbert," he announced, brandishing what appeared to be a very old tooth in a glass vial. "With this sacred artifact, I banish thee, foul spirit, to the outer darkness." The moment the reliquary left its protective casing, the entire room seemed to inhale sharply. The air grew heavy, pressing down like a physical weight. Alistair felt an odd tugging sensation, not painful but inexorable, like a tide pulling at sand. For the first time in centuries, he experienced something akin to panic. "Wait," he tried to say, but his voice emerged as little more than a whisper of wind. Cora, sensing something was genuinely wrong, pushed forward. "Okay, that's enough. You've done your little show, now put the creepy tooth away before the power of Christ compels you." Bishop Thorne roared, thrusting the reliquary directly at the space where Alistair hovered. The effect was immediate and devastating. Alistair felt himself unraveling, his essence scattering like smoke in a gale. The carefully maintained ties that had kept him anchored to Blackthorn Keep for centuries, the memories, the routines, the unfinished business, snapped one by one. Dimly, he heard Dr. Wren gasp, "But, Your Grace, stop. Look at the tapestries." Even the bishop paused at that. Every medieval tapestry in the library, the painstakingly preserved hunting scenes, the floral borders, Eleanor's favorite with the hidden mouse, was vibrating as if caught in a hurricane. The threads strained against their weaves, some snapping entirely, sending colorful puffs of wool drifting to the floor. Alistair clung to those threads, both literal and metaphorical. They were his last anchors, his final connections to the world he'd loved and lost. But the pull of the relic was too strong. His fading consciousness registered Cora's voice, uncharacteristically desperate. "Alistair!" Then, nothing. A profound silence settled over the library. The tapestries stilled. The clergyman gaped. Even Bishop Thorne looked faintly surprised by his own success. Dr. Wren was the first to speak, her voice hushed. Is it over?" The bishop, recovering his composure, nodded solemnly. "The demon has been vanquished." Cora stared at the space where Alistair had been, her expression unreadable. Then, abruptly, she turned on her heel and walked out. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting Blackthorn Keep in perfect, unbroken white. Somewhere, nowhere, everywhere. Alistair opened eyes he didn't have anymore and found himself standing in a sunlit meadow that smelled inexplicably of fresh parchment and lavender. Before him, a familiar figure turned, her ink-stained fingers pausing mid-sentence in some long-forgotten manuscript. "Took you long enough," said Eleanor. And for the first time in 600 years, Alistair didn't just feel warmth. He felt home. Chapter 14. Post-Exorcism Realization. The silence in Blackthorn Keep was louder than any ghostly wail had ever been. Cora sat alone in the great hall, staring at the spot where Alistair had last manifested, right before Bishop Thorne and his cursed tooth relic had unraveled 6 centuries of spectral existence. The castle staff had given her a wide berth since the exorcism, though whether out of respect or fear remained unclear. Even the mice seemed to be avoiding the main halls, their tiny claws no longer scratching through the walls at all hours. Dr. Wren found her there at dusk, hesitating in the doorway like someone approaching a fresh grave. "I brought your oat cakes," she said, holding out a paper bag that smelled of cinnamon and butter. "The kitchen staff said you hadn't eaten." Cora didn't look up. "He liked oat cakes, used to try to smell them when I ate them nearby. Said it reminded him of feast days." The historian winced, setting the bag on the table with careful precision. "Miss Holloway." "Cora, Docton." "Cora, I want you to know I never intended for—" "You brought in the holy artillery." Cora finally lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, after seeing firsthand that he was about as dangerous as a lost puppy. Dr. Wren sank into the chair opposite, her academic poise fraying at the edges. "I panicked when I felt his hand. It was cold. Not like winter cold, like absence cold. I reacted badly." She traced a finger along the grain of the ancient table. "But you must understand, as a historian, I've spent my career trying to reconstruct lives from fragments, ledgers, letters, household accounts, and then to actually meet someone who lived it." Her voice trailed off. Cora studied her for a long moment before reaching for an oatcake. "You know what kills me? He kept those records you love so much. Every harvest, every feast, every missing cheese wheel. That fussy ghost was the reason we know anything about daily life in this castle." She took a savage bite. And now some overzealous clergyman's turned him into a footnote. The truth of this settled over them both. Outside, the first stars appeared through the high windows, the same ones Alistair had once complained needed proper tapestries to block the drafts. Elsewhere in the castle, Bishop Thorne was holding court in the guest quarters, regaling his fellow clergymen with dramatically embellished tales of his spiritual triumph. The demon fought fiercely, he declared, accepting a glass of the castle's best wine, which Cora had spitefully marked up 300% for clergy. But the power of faith prevailed. One of the younger priests frowned. "Your Grace, if I may, the records do show this Alistair was known to be quite helpful. There are accounts of him." "Nonsense." The bishop waved his glass, sloshing wine onto the newly restored tapestries. "All evil disguises itself as light. Why, that very argument proves how insidious this spirit was." The priests murmured agreement, though a few exchanged uneasy glances. Down in the kitchens, the staff had noticed other absences. The temperature no longer dropped unexpectedly in the west corridor. The display cases stayed firmly closed, unless a living hand opened them. And most tellingly, the gift shop's guaranteed ghost sightings counter had stopped ticking entirely. Mrs. Peabody, the head housekeeper, crossed herself as she polished a candlestick. "Never thought I'd miss that drafty feeling," she muttered. By week's end, even the tourists had noticed the change. The castle felt different, not safer but emptier, like a book with its best pages torn out. Visitor numbers dropped sharply, despite the sudden lack of supernatural occurrences. "Turns out people don't actually want historical accuracy," Cora remarked to no one as she updated the admissions ledger. "They want a good story." Dr. Wren, who had taken to haunting the archives with newfound fervor, looked up from a 14th century parchment. "We could tell his story properly." She gestured to the stacks of documents around her. "There's enough here to reconstruct his life with remarkable detail. The real Alistair, not the caricature." Cora considered this, tapping her pen against the ledger. In the silence they both heard it, the faintest creak of a floorboard upstairs, the softest sigh of wind through a crack no one had yet found. Or perhaps just imagination. "Make it honest," Cora said at last. "None of that tragic Specter doomed to wander nonsense. He'd hate that." Dr. Wren nodded, already reaching for another parchment. "I'll start with the cheese thefts. Those seem to capture his personality." And so work began on the first proper biography of Alistair of Blackthorn Keep, steward, ghost, and terrible judge of appropriate human interaction. In the great hall, a new plaque appeared beside his favorite tapestry, this one bearing not just dates and titles, but an actual likeness reconstructed from historical records. Visitors paused to read it, some crossing themselves, others laughing at the account of the great cheese wheel debacle of 1392. A few even left oatcakes on the ledge beneath, though whether as tribute or because Cora kept sneaking them, there remained unclear. As autumn deepened into winter, something peculiar happened. The castle's reputation shifted, not as a haunted house, but as a place where history felt alive in a different way. Visitors came not for cheap thrills, but to stand where a real person had lived, worked, and inexplicably lingered for centuries. And if the taps sometimes ran unexpectedly, or doors swung shut with no draft to explain it, well, old buildings settled. Everyone knew that. Cora certainly never mentioned seeing faint shapes in her peripheral vision, or hearing a familiar sigh when the night guard's change shifts. Some truths didn't need proving. After all, as any good historian knew, absence could be its own kind of presence. And in that absence, Alistair's story, finally, began to be told. Chapter 15. Blackthorn Keep's Unexpected Silence. Winter settled over Blackthorn Keep like a heavy woolen cloak, muffling the castle in a stillness it hadn't known for centuries. The staff moved through the halls with uncharacteristic quiet, their footsteps no longer punctuated by the distant moans of a ghost trying and failing to make polite conversation. Mrs. Peabody found herself missing the way the silverware used to rattle unexpectedly during tea service, though she'd complained about it for years. The silence was most noticeable in the great hall, where the absence of Alistair's running commentary on castle affairs left a gap no historical plaque could fill. Cora caught young Tom, one of the tour guides, standing motionless before the newly installed biography display, staring at the artist's rendering of Alistair as if expecting it to speak. "Miss the old chatterbox, do you?" Cora asked, startling him from his reverie. Tom flushed. "It's just odd, isn't it? No floating candlesticks and no mysterious drafts. Even the gift shop's ghost detector stopped working." He gestured to the corner where a $79.99 Specter sensor now gathered dust. Turns out it was just picking up Alistair's grumbling all along. Cora snorted but couldn't bring herself to disagree. The castle had become what it always should have been, a well-preserved historical site with excellent visitor numbers and fully functional electrical systems. And yet, something vital was missing. Even Bishop Thorne seemed affected by the change. When he returned to bless the castle's new spiritual heritage center, complete with tastefully backlit relic display, he paused mid-benediction, his nostrils flaring as if searching for some trace of supernatural presence. His sermon about triumph over darkness rang hollow in the too-quiet chapel. The mice noticed too. With no ghostly presence to avoid, they grew bold, venturing into open spaces they'd previously shunned. One particularly intrepid rodent took up residence in the gift shop's oatcake supply, much to Cora's amusement. "At least someone's enjoying them," she muttered, watching it stuff its cheeks full. Dr. Wren became a near-permanent fixture in the archives, her research expanding from Alistair's ledgers to every aspect of 14th-century castle life. Visitors often found her murmuring to the empty air as she worked, as if carrying on a conversation with someone only she could see. When asked about it, she'd smile faintly and say, "Historical research requires imagination." The real change came on the first anniversary of Alistair's exorcism. A storm rolled in from the north, rattling the castle windows with unusual ferocity. Cora, making her final rounds, paused in the great hall as a particularly strong gust shook the tapestries, including Eleanor's favorite, which had been carefully rehung after its dramatic reaction to the exorcism. For just a moment, the woven hunting scene seemed to ripple more than the others, the embroidered hounds appearing to leap as if in pursuit of something just beyond the fabric's edge. A draft, surely just a draft, sent a chill down Cora's spine that felt suspiciously familiar. Then, the moment passed. The tapestries stilled. The castle returned to its perfect, ghostless silence. Cora sighed, reaching into her pocket for an oatcake. She broke it in half, leaving one piece on the windowsill where the moonlight could find it. "Miss you too, you fussy old ghost," she murmured. "Somewhere, nowhere, everywhere." A breeze that wasn't quite a breeze stirred through a meadow that smelled of parchment and lavender. Eleanor looked up from her writing with a knowing smile. "She left you another one," she said to the empty air beside her. And if the space next to her shimmered slightly with something like laughter, well, that was between them. Back at Blackthorn Keep, life went on, quieter perhaps, but no less rich for the stories it contained. Visitors still came, drawn by history rather than hauntings. The staff still grumbled about odd jobs and eccentric tourists. And high in the rafters, if the occasional oatcake went missing overnight, well, everyone knew castles had mice. Chapter 16. The Unlikely Advocate. Marcus Finch arrived at Blackthorn, Keep with a reputation for debunking paranormal claims, and a skepticism so dense it could stop bullets. His popular column Ghosts, Schmosts had taken down mediums, exposed haunted house scams, and once conclusively proved that a miraculous weeping statue was actually a poorly installed plumbing issue. When his editor assigned him to investigate the so-called friendly ghost of Blackthorn Keep, Marcus saw it as an open and shut case of mass hysteria. He expected to find the usual trappings of ghost tourism: misinterpreted noises, clever lighting, and a gift shop full of overpriced nonsense. What he didn't expect was the palpable sense of loss that hung over the castle like fog. Cora eyed him warily when he presented his press credentials at the ticket booth. "Let me guess," she said, sliding his visitor pass across the counter. "You're here to tell us how we imagined 6 centuries of documented hauntings." Marcus flashed his most disarming grin. "I'm here to uncover the truth, whatever that may be." The truth, as Marcus quickly discovered, was complicated. He started with the staff interviews. Mrs. Peabody, the head housekeeper, teared up describing how the castle's temperature had remained stubbornly consistent since that blessed bishop interfered. Young Tom, the tour guide, spoke with surprising eloquence about the ghost's attempts at communication through the years. Even the gift shop attendant, a teenager who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, admitted missing the way the electronic ghost detectors used to light up for no reason. Most puzzling was Dr. Wren, who had transformed from terrified historian to Alistair's posthumous champion. She presented Marcus with meticulously organized binders full of evidence, centuries of visitor accounts, castle maintenance records showing inexplicable repairs, even spectral analysis of the famous photobomb Selfie. "This," she said, tapping a finger on a 17th century ledger entry, "is an account from a visiting nobleman who claims the ghost helped him find a lost signet ring. And here," she flipped to a modern incident report, "a 2018 guest log noting that a floating quill pointed out an error in our historical display about medieval." Marcus frowned. "You're telling me this ghost was helpful?" Dr. Wren's smile was bittersweet. "Incredibly so, and incredibly lonely, if the records are any indication." By his 3rd day at the castle, Marcus found himself reluctantly charmed by the story of the fussy, well-meaning steward ghost. The sheer volume of corroborating evidence was difficult to dismiss, not just recent tourist accounts, but documents spanning centuries. He spent hours in the archives, cross-referencing reports of hauntings with castle events, finding patterns no hoax could explain. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered a box of unarchived visitor letters in a storage closet. Among the usual ghost sighting accounts was a faded envelope postmarked 1923. Inside, an elderly woman's shaky handwriting described being comforted as a child by a transparent gentleman after she got separated from her tour group during a storm. "I thought he was a caretaker at first," the letter read. "He had such kind eyes, though they glowed strangely in the dark. He stayed with me until help came, humming what sounded like a very old song. When the searchers arrived, he simply wasn't there anymore." Marcus read the letter 3 times before setting it carefully aside. His hands, usually so steady when typing blistering takedowns of paranormal frauds, trembled slightly. That night, in his too-quiet hotel room, Marcus drafted an article unlike anything he'd ever written. The headline stared back at him from his laptop screen: "The Ghosts We Wronged. How Blackthorn Keep Lost Its Most Beloved Resident." He hesitated before hitting send, his finger hovering over the key. The piece would ruin his reputation as a hardened skeptic. His editor would likely reject it outright. His fellow debunkers would never let him hear the end of it. Marcus thought of the empty great hall where visitors still occasionally left oatcakes beneath Alistair's portrait. He thought of the way Dr. Wren's voice caught when she described reading the ghost's original ledgers. He thought of Cora's sharp eyes daring him to call them all fools. He sent the article. When it published, against all odds and editorial judgment, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Former visitors came forward with their own stories of odd but helpful encounters. Paranormal investigators reevaluated old evidence. Even Bishop Thorne found himself quietly removed from the diocese's spiritual crisis response team. The castle saw a new influx of visitors, though not the ghost-hunting crowds of before. These were pilgrims of sorts, drawn by the story of the lonely steward rather than cheap thrills. They lingered in the library where Alistair had last manifested. They studied his meticulous records with newfound respect. Some even brought oatcakes, though none ever saw them disappear. Marcus returned to Blackthorn Keep one final time as winter turned to spring. He stood alone in the great hall, as the evening light slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor. "I'm sorry," he said to the empty air, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what it's worth, I believe you now." The castle, as always these days, remained silent, but as Marcus turned to leave, he could have sworn, just for a moment, that the faintest breath of wind stirred the edges of Eleanor's tapestry, setting the embroidered hounds running once more. "Somewhere else, somewhere better," Alistair smiled. Chapter 17. Ghost Hunting Regrets. The spectral showdown team gathered in their cramped production office, the walls papered with maps of haunted locations and whiteboards filled with scrawled theories about demonic classifications. Their Blackthorn Keep footage played on the monitor, the same footage that had earned them over 2 million views and a spike in their Patreon subscriptions. Dave hit pause on the video, freezing the image of Brent dramatically spraying holy water while Lisa clutched Mr. Hoots. "Okay," he said, rubbing his temples. "Let's watch this again from the top, and this time actually look at what's happening." They'd been reviewing the footage for what felt like the 100th time since Marcus Finch's article went viral. What had once seemed like clear evidence of a dangerous haunting now looked different. Brent crossed his arms, his biceps straining against his Team Exorcism t-shirt. "I don't get what we're supposed to be seeing here. That ghost was clearly class 4, maybe even 5. "Just watch," Dave interrupted, restarting the video. The footage showed their first moments in the great hall. Brent's booming voice echoed through the speakers. "Spirit! Show yourself!" On screen, a faint shimmer appeared near the fireplace. Not the ominous manifestation they described in their voiceover, but something almost hesitant. When Alistair's voice emerged, "That's a very sturdy brush you have there." It was distorted but unmistakably polite. Lisa gasped. "Oh my God." He was making conversation. Dave nodded grimly, advancing the footage to when Alistair had attempted to correct Brent about the castle's history. The ghost's words, actually those were added after the siege of 1387, were barely audible beneath their own panicked screaming. Brent shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Okay, so maybe he knew some history. That doesn't mean—" "Keep watching," Dave said. The footage showed their disastrous attempt at spirit communication. Every time Alistair tried to speak through the ghost-hunting equipment, they'd either screamed over him or misinterpreted his words. When he gently tapped the candlestick in response to their questions, they'd fled as though the hounds of hell were at their heels. Lisa buried her face in Mr. Hoots. "We were terrible to him," she mumbled into the stuffed owl's feathers. "He was just trying to talk, and we treated him like some kind of monster." The final clip was the hardest to watch. Their triumphant wrap-up outside the castle, where they declared Blackthorn Keep a hotbed of supernatural danger and warned viewers against visiting. The camera had caught something they hadn't noticed at the time. A faint face in the tower window, watching them leave with what could only be described as profound disappointment. Dave turned off the monitor. The office was silent except for the hum of their overworked computers. Brent cleared his throat. "Okay, so maybe we misjudged the situation slightly." "Slightly?" Lisa shrieked, hurling Mr. Hoots at him. "We took history's loneliest ghost and turned him into clickbait." Dave sighed and pulled up their YouTube analytics. The worst part, our audience loved the friendly ghost angle when Marcus wrote about it. Our Patreon doubled after we posted that follow-up video walking back our initial claims. Lisa wiped her eyes. We should have listened to him. He was right there, trying to tell us who he was, and we just kept shouting Latin at him. Brent, for once, had no bombastic response. He stared at the paused image on the monitor. That sad, translucent face in the window. What do we do now? Dave closed the editing software. We make it right. Or try to, anyway. 2 weeks later, a new video appeared on the Spectral Showdown channel. Unlike their usual fare, it opened with quiet footage of Blackthorn Keep at dawn, the morning mist curling around its towers. The title read simply, "We were wrong about Blackthorn Keep." The video featured no dramatic reenactments, no spooky music, no exaggerated claims. Just the team walking soberly through the castle, interviewing staff and historians about Alistair's true nature. They showed the steward's meticulous records, read accounts of his helpful interventions over the centuries, and, in what would become the most commented on moment, apologized directly to the empty Great Hall. "I wish we'd listened," Lisa said, her voice breaking as she placed an oatcake beneath Alistair's portrait. "You deserve better from us." The video ended with Dave reading from one of Alistair's 14th century ledgers, a surprisingly poetic description of the castle's apple harvest that concluded with, "The trees stand heavy with fruit, yet the halls feel empty still. Perhaps next year will bring warmer company." Viewers noted something odd about the final shot. As the camera panned away from the ledger, what looked like a faint breath of wind stirred the pages, though no windows were open in the archive room. Back in their office, the Spectral Showdown team watched the comments roll in. Most were supportive, though a few longtime fans grumbled about them going soft. None of that mattered to Lisa, who kept replaying the last few seconds of footage. "Did you see that?" she asked for the dozenth time. The pages moved. Dave smiled faintly. "Maybe some ghosts don't need convincing to forgive." Brent, uncharacteristically quiet, reached for their next case file. "A reportedly haunted library," and wrote "Approach with respect" across the top in bold letters. Somewhere beyond the veil, if such places existed, a ghostly steward might have nodded approvingly before returning to his eternal rest. Finally, blessedly understood. Chapter 18. A memorial in the gift shop. The new merchandise arrived in bright cardboard boxes that smelled of synthetic ink and poor life choices. Cora slid open the first package with her pocket knife, revealing a stack of t-shirts emblazoned with a cartoon ghost wearing a painfully exaggerated smile, and the words, "I hugged the ghost of Blackthorn Keep." Beneath, the design showed the Specter with its arms outstretched in what was presumably meant to be a friendly embrace, but looked more like an impending assault. "This," Cora announced to no one in particular, "is an abomination." The gift shop manager, a perpetually enthusiastic woman named Marjorie, who had previously worked at a zoo gift shop, and it showed, clapped her hands together. "Aren't they marvelous? The focus groups loved them. We're doing a whole line. Mugs, keychains, even plush ghosts with little arms that velcro around water bottles for the full hugging experience." Cora stared at the plush prototype Marjorie produced from another box. Its stitched-on eyes were disturbingly lopsided, giving it the appearance of a spirit mid-exorcism. "You do realize Alistair spent 6 centuries failing to get a single hug, right? This feels like rubbing salt in a very old wound." "Ah, nonsense." Marjorie adjusted her world's best grandma name tag, a bold claim given she was 32. "It's celebratory, like how people buy I Survived the Haunted Mansion shirts." "Everyone loves a good ghost story." Cora opened her mouth to argue, then noticed the line already forming outside the gift shop. Visitors peeked through the windows at the new merchandise, their faces alight with the particular excitement of people about to make tacky purchases they'd later regret. With a sigh, Cora stepped aside as Marjorie flung open the doors. The ensuing rush would have put Black Friday sales to shame. Within minutes, The first customers emerged wearing their new shirts. The ghostly embrace stretched awkwardly across their chests. A group of teenagers took selfies in front of Alistair's portrait, making exaggerated hugging motions while their friend snapped photos. Cora watched as one particularly enthusiastic visitor pretended to be strangled by the plush ghost's Velcro arms, while his friends howled with laughter. Dr. Wren appeared at her elbow, clutching a small paper bag from the archives. "I see the memorialization is going well," she observed dryly. Cora gestured to where a child was rubbing his new ghost plushie on the Great Hall's walls, like some sort of paranormal squeegee. "This is worse than the exorcism. At least that was over quickly." They watched in silence as the gift shop's line grew longer. The castle's new interactive ghost experience, which consisted of standing in a marked spot where Alistair had once manifested while an audio recording played his least terrifying moans, had a wait time of 40 minutes. Dr. Wren cleared her throat. "For what it's worth, I've nearly finished compiling Alistair's complete household accounts. The British Historical Society wants to publish them as an annotated collection." She held out the paper bag. "I thought you might like to see the proofs before they go to press." Cora opened the bag to find a bound galley titled Gay Fee Meticulous Ghost, the complete household accounts of Alistair of Blackthorn Keep, 1385, 1392. Flipping through the pages, she found not just dry financial records, but annotations highlighting Alistair's personality, his dry humor, in describing kitchen mishaps, his quiet pride in the castle's improvements, even his increasingly poetic descriptions of Eleanor's work as scribe. "Historical accuracy isn't always flashy," Dr. Wren said, watching Cora trace a finger over a particularly eloquent passage about autumn apple harvests. "But it lasts longer than a Velcro ghost plushie." Cora handed back the proofs. "He would have hated that thing. He would have moaned about it endlessly," Dr. Wren agreed. "And then secretly been pleased anyone remembered him at all." As if on cue, a gust of wind swept through the great hall, though all the windows were closed, sending the new hug of ghost banners flapping wildly. One tore free of its moorings and floated gently down to land directly on the head of the teenager, pretending to be strangled by his plush toy. Cora and Dr. Wren exchanged glances. "Coincidence," Cora said firmly. "Absolutely," agreed Dr. Wren. But neither moved to help the flailing teenager as he stumbled into a display of ghost hug mugs, setting off a chain reaction of clattering ceramics. In the gift shop, the electronic ghost detectors, silent for months, suddenly lit up in a wild display before going dark again. Marjorie squealed with delight. "We're haunted again." Cora sighed and reached for an oatcake. Some things, it seemed, never changed, even in death. Chapter 19. Whispers in the Tapestries. The first incident occurred during the annual textile conservation check. Mrs. Peabody, armed with her white gloves and meticulous checklist, noted something peculiar about Eleanor's favorite tapestry, the hunting scene Alistair had so often admired. The normally static embroidered hounds appeared to have shifted position ever so slightly, their stitched paws now mid-gallop rather than at rest as they had been documented for decades. "You're seeing things," the visiting conservator told her when she pointed it out. "Wool threads relax over time. It's perfectly normal." Mrs. Peabody said nothing. But later that evening, Cora found her standing before the tapestry with 2 oatcakes on a china plate. "For the mice," the housekeeper said briskly when caught, though everyone knew the castle's rodents had never been served on fine porcelain before. The anomalies multiplied as winter deepened. A young docent swore she heard faint humming near the east tower, a tune that matched the description in that 1923 letter Marcus Finch had uncovered. The gift shop's ghost detectors began activating at random intervals, always near the textile displays. Most tellingly, visitors started reporting strange behavior from the hug-a-ghost plushies, their Velcro arms found clinging to tapestry edges when no one had placed them there. Dr. Wren became obsessed with the phenomenon. She set up a discreet camera in the great hall, ostensibly to monitor the tapestry's condition. What it captured was more intriguing than conclusive. Midnight footage showing the fabric stirring when no drafts could explain the movement. Their embroidered scenes were rippling as if alive. In one particularly compelling sequence, the hunting hound seemed to chase a newly appeared Stitch, a tiny, barely visible mouse darting through the foliage where none had been before. "The conservation team says it's impossible," Dr. Wren told Cora, as they reviewed the footage in the archives. "They claim these tapestries haven't been altered in centuries." Cora studied the screen where the embroidered scene continued its subtle transformations. The once static hunting party now showed a figure in steward's robes, observing from the margins. "You realize if we show this to Marjorie, she'll start selling haunted tapestry experience tickets by tomorrow morning." Dr. Wren zoomed in on the new figure. "I'm not saying it's Alistair, but the stitchwork matches 14th century techniques exactly. And look," she pointed to the figure's barely visible smile. "That's the same expression he had in the photobomb Selfie." They might have dismissed it as overactive imaginations if not for the Ledger incident. The castle's oldest financial records, Alistair's own meticulous work, began showing fresh annotations in margin. Faded but legible, the new notes appeared in an ink that matched the original, with handwriting that perfectly replicated the steward's distinctive script. Next to an entry about repairing the East Tower stairs, a newly materialized note read, "Still creaks in winter. Some things never change." The staff developed a quiet understanding not to discuss these occurrences with visitors. The conservation team attributed the tapestry changes to previously undocumented restoration work. The docents learned to laugh off questions about faint humming as just the castle settling. Even Marjorie in the gift shop, normally eager to capitalize on anything supernatural, found herself hesitating to market the phenomena. "We owe him this much," she admitted to Cora one evening, as they watched a new mother lift her toddler to pet the embroidered hounds. The child giggled as the threads shimmered faintly under small fingers. A little dignity in death. Cora said nothing, but that night she placed 2 oatcakes beneath the hunting tapestry, one for the mice and one for whatever else might still linger in the castle's fabric. As she turned to leave, the faintest breath of wind stirred the threads, sending the embroidered steward's hand lifting in what might have been a wave, or perhaps just a trick of the light. Either way, when Cora returned in the morning, both oatcakes were gone. And in the margins of the newest visitor logbook, a familiar hand had added one barely perceptible notation. "Thank you." Chapter 20. A new ghost's first day. The first sign something was wrong came when the castle's newly installed coffee machine began spewing what appeared to be blood. Then the temperature in the west wing dropped so suddenly that frost formed on the gift shop's hug of ghost plushies overnight. By lunchtime, 3 separate visitors had fled screaming from the East Tower after encountering a shadowy figure that definitely wasn't part of the historical reenactment troupe. Cora found Dr. Wren in the archives, both of them staring at a security monitor showing the Great Hall where a suit of armor had just levitated 6 feet off the ground before dramatically impaling itself on a chandelier. "Well," Cora said, crunching on an oatcake, "this is new." Dr. Wren adjusted her glasses. "According to the records, this sort of behavior matches descriptions of the 3rd Lord Blackthorn. Died in 1473 after a particularly ill-advised attempt to invent fireworks indoors. The accounts describe him as temperamental in death." On screen, the suit of armor's helmet spun violently before rocketing toward the camera with a metallic shriek. The feed cut to static. Cora sighed. "Of course, we finally get rid of history's loneliest ghost, and the universe sends us a medieval frat boy with pyromania." Up in the East Tower, the newest spectral resident of Blackthorn Keep was already making himself at home. Lord Reginald, the improbable Blackthorn, floated through the stone walls, relishing the way the living flinched at his sudden appearances. No sad hovering near tapestries for him. No, sir. If he was doomed to haunt this drafty pile of rocks, he'd do it with style. He materialized fully in the gift shop, enjoying the way the shop girl's eyes bulged as his form took shape, all billowing doublet and dramatically pointed beard. "You," he bellowed in his best haunting voice. "What year is it?" The girl fainted directly onto a rack of "I Survived the Haunted Castle" t-shirts. Lord Reginald grinned. This was more like it. Down in the great hall, Cora and Dr. Wren watched as the new ghost's antics played out across multiple security feeds. Wine barrels rolling themselves ominously down corridors, mysterious scorch marks appearing on tapestries, an entire display of replica goblets arranged into a rude shape. "The good news," Dr. Wren said, flipping through a crumbling ledger, "is that historical accounts suggest Lord Reginald's hauntings were seasonal. He tended to, burn himself out after a few months of particularly vigorous scaring." Cora groaned. "We're doomed." Just then, something peculiar happened on one of the monitors. The feed showed Lord Reginald preparing to fling a candlestick at a group of tourists, when suddenly, inexplicably, the projectile changed trajectory mid-air, veering sharply left to land harmlessly on a cushion. The ghost's furious expression morphed into confusion as his spectral form flickered oddly. Dr. Wren leaned closer. "Did you see?" "I saw," Cora interrupted. On screen, Lord Reginald spun around, bellowing at the empty air. "Who dares interfere?" His words emerged as visible puffs of spectral energy swirling toward something near the hunting tapestry. The fabric rippled violently, though no wind could explain the movement. Then, clear as day on the high-definition camera, one of the embroidered hounds turned its head and snapped at Lord Reginald's ghostly coattails. The new ghost yelped, an undignified sound that made several tourists giggle despite themselves. He whirled toward the tapestry, pointing an accusing finger. "You, steward, I should have known you'd still be hovering about." The tapestry's threads shimmered. The embroidered steward's figure, now noticeably more detailed than in previous documentation, lifted one carefully stitched hand in a gesture that could only be described as a dismissive wave. Lord Reginald howled in frustration, his form flickering like a candle in a draught. "This isn't over," he threatened before vanishing in a puff of smoke that set off 3 fire alarms. Silence fell over the great hall. The tourists exchanged confused glances. Then, from somewhere near the hunting tapestry, came the faintest sound, a ghostly chuckle that made the newly repaired chandelier tinkle pleasantly. Cora and Dr. Wren stared at each other. "I'll get the oatcakes," Cora said. And somewhere beyond the veil, or perhaps woven into it, a particularly stubborn ghost settled back to watch over his castle once more, ready to teach the new spirit some much-needed manners. After 6 centuries, Blackthorn Keep steward had finally gotten what he'd always wanted: company. Even if that company was an insufferable pyromaniac nobleman. Somewhere in the meadow that smelled of parchment and lavender, Eleanor sighed as her riding companion disappeared mid-sentence. "Off to play guardian ghost again?" she called after him. The wind that wasn't quite a wind carried back his answer. "It's a steward's duty." And if the newly arrived Lord Reginald found himself mysteriously unable to scare anyone after that day, if his fireballs fizzled and his haunting moans turned inexplicably comical, well, that was between ghosts.